I'm Josh, and this happened to me when I was in high school, which was around the year 2006. I grew up in a very close-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other. I had a good group of friends. My best friend was Andrew, and I had a few other really close friends as well. There was only one elementary school there, and one high school, so while the kids went to the same school, we all got to know each other really well that way. It was the perfect place to grow up, and I loved it. That all changed when a new kid moved in a few doors down from me, though. His name was Mason, and from the moment we met, I knew there was something off about him. He never smiled, never made eye contact, and always kept to himself. I know it can be tough to be the new kid. Me and my friends were already really close, so it would have been really difficult for him to fit in socially. At first I thought he was just shy, but as time went on, I realized it was much more than that. Mason was creepy. There was something about the way he looked at you that made you feel like he was sizing you up, like he was deciding whether or not you were worthy of his attention. That was strange, because usually when there would be a new kid, it would be the opposite. They would try really hard to be accepted. Mason didn't do that. I hardly ever heard him speak. The only time I ever heard him talk was in class when the teacher asked him something directly. I started to avoid him, but I couldn't help but be drawn to him at the same time. It was like a puzzle, and I wanted to solve it, more out of curiosity than anything else. One day, I decided to try to talk to him. I walked up to him at lunch and sat down next to him. He always sat alone. I asked him about his family and what he liked to do for fun, anything to try to get to know him, but he just stared at me, not saying a single word. It felt like I was talking to a brick wall, and after an uncomfortable silence, I got up and went back to my friends. "How did it go?" Andrew asked. "I don't know. Something's off about that guy," I told him. We decided after that we would just try to avoid Mason. I didn't know what was going on with him, but I sure didn't want to be on his bad side either. My friends and I figured that we should be nice, but keep our distance, and that's what we did for a while. As the days went on, strange things started to happen. Someone broke into my neighbor's house and stole some money and some other stuff. A few days after that, there was a fire in the woods down the street from the school. It was clearly started intentionally, because there were never any natural forest fires in the area. We all thought that Mason was behind it, but the teachers and parents wouldn't say it out loud. They saw Mason as a troubled young man who was having trouble fitting in, and they didn't want to add to his misery. My friends and I knew better, though. We wanted to get to the bottom of it, so we tried searching on the internet for news articles or something. Unfortunately, since it was 2006, the internet was not what it is now, and there really wasn't anything to be found. One night, however, I was walking home from a friend's house when I heard a noise coming from the woods. It sounded like Mason talking to someone. That was strange because he almost never talked. I followed it and came across Mason. He was pacing back and forth in the woods, talking to himself. I had no idea what he was saying, though. It was pure nonsense. I hid behind a tree so he wouldn't see me, and I watched a little longer. When I looked closer, I saw that he had a large knife in his right hand. I turned around and carefully got out of there. He didn't notice me. When I got home, I told my parents, but no one believed me. They thought I was just trying to get attention. But I knew what I saw, and I knew Mason was dangerous. Not long after, there was a fire at Mason's house in the middle of the night. Luckily, nobody was hurt because Mason's dad was awake for some reason, and he managed to get the rest of the family to safety. The police investigated as a suspected arson, and they found out it was set intentionally. Not only that, but the smoke detectors were disabled. Mason was charged for setting the fire and attempting to kill his entire family. I never saw or heard from him again after that. It was a wake-up call for our community. Nothing like that had happened to us before. Mason's family moved away soon after. I guess the whispers and looks would be too much for them. I can't say I blame them. I tried to do some research on Mason and what happened to him since, but I couldn't find anything. Maybe that's a good sign, and he's turned his life around. I hope so anyway. I had always felt like there was something off about my neighbor, who we'll call Mr. Johnson. He lived a few doors down when I was growing up. Mr. Johnson lived alone in the largest house on the street, and nobody really knew anything about him. He was always quiet and kept to himself, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel really uneasy. I would see him in passing almost every day, but we never talked. He was about 50 years old, if I had to guess. He had short gray hair and a mustache, and he walked with a limp, but I'm not sure why. It wasn't until I was home alone one day that I discovered the true extent of his creepiness. It was a typical summer day, and I was playing video games in my room. My room was at the back of the house. When I game, I always like to tune out the rest of the world, so I closed my curtains and turned off the lights. I also have a good noise-canceling headset. Suddenly, I felt like somebody had come home. That was strange because my parents were not supposed to be home until the following day. Like I said, I couldn't hear anything, but I could feel a pair of footsteps stomping around the house. I was pretty sure someone had broken in. I paused my game and removed my headset, then listened closely, but the sound had stopped. I shrugged it off and continued playing, but after a few minutes, it started again. This time it was stronger and more persistent. I could feel each step rattle through my body. I got up to investigate. I tiptoed out of my room and cautiously walked down the stairs. I peeked carefully around each corner as I made my way to the kitchen, which is where it seemed like the noise was coming from. When I entered the kitchen, I saw that one of the cabinets was open. I was sure that I had closed it before I started playing, but there it was, wide open. I approached the cabinet, my heart racing with fear. As I reached the handle, I heard a rustling sound coming from behind me. I spun around, and there he was. Mr. Johnson was standing in my kitchen, with a blank look on his face. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I'm pretty sure he was drunk. Mr. Johnson just stood there, silently looking at me. "What are you doing in my house, Mr. Johnson?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling.
"I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you,"
he said in a calm voice.
"Your mom called me and asked me if I could see if you're okay."
There was no way that was true. I was 14 years old at the time, and I'd been left home alone more times than I could count. If my mom wanted to check on me, she would just call me on the phone. I was skeptical, but I didn't want to start a confrontation with that guy, so I told him I was fine and thanked him. He turned around and walked away, but as he was leaving, he turned around to me and said,
"See you soon, kid."
I was left feeling rattled and disturbed. I didn't understand how he'd gotten into my house. I was sure I'd locked the door. I stayed up that entire night too scared to sleep, and when my parents got home, I told them what happened. As soon as I got halfway through the story, my dad had already called the police and reported the incident. They told me they would investigate. The police interviewed Mr. Johnson, but he denied anything happened at all. It was my word against his, so there was not much we could do. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Wasn't my account evidence enough? Over the following weeks, I hardly slept a wink. Every noise and every creak shook me. I went out of my way to avoid seeing that guy, but it was hard. Around that time, my father installed a set of security cameras to help put my mind at ease. One morning, after reviewing the footage, my father called the police. Mr. Johnson was back. With that evidence, they were able to arrest him and perform a search on his house. What they found was far more disturbing than I could have imagined. Mr. Johnson had his own key to our house, as well as keys to several of our neighbors' houses. I still can't explain how he got it. He was sentenced to jail time, and I never saw him again. To this day, I still have nightmares about Mr. Johnson and the way he used to look at me. I moved out of that house as soon as I was old enough, and my parents moved shortly after. It's hard to think that things wouldn't have escalated beyond creepy. I'm sure if he wasn't stopped, then someone would have gotten hurt. It was a really close call, and by far the creepiest thing that I've ever experienced. This happened almost a decade ago, when I was in my early 20s. I used to visit my grandmother a few times each year, always in the summer because she lived in Minnesota, and the winters were really rough. My grandmother lived in a fairly small town, and I loved the quiet, peaceful atmosphere. Her place was in an apartment complex that was made up of 5 buildings, which were all only 2 stories. They formed a square, and they faced a large courtyard in the middle where there was a swimming pool. I always liked visiting, but during one visit, things took a dark and frightening turn. It was a beautiful day, and I was walking to the local grocery store to pick up some items for my grandmother. As I was walking, I noticed a man who lived in the apartment complex walking behind me. I'd been in town for just 2 days at the time, and I'd seen him around before, but not on any of my previous trips, so I figured he must be new. I tried to ignore him, but every time I turned around, he was there, always a few steps behind me. I thought I might just be too paranoid, but something about him did make me feel scared. He was walking way too close behind me. I stopped on the sidewalk and moved to the side, hoping he would pass, but he didn't. He stopped as well. I began to feel nervous and sped up to get back to my grandmother's apartment. The man continued to follow me, keeping the same distance. It didn't seem to matter how fast I walked. I was about to start running when I heard my grandmother's voice calling out. I was finally there. I turned around and saw her standing in the doorway of her apartment with a stern look on her face. The man quickly turned and walked in the opposite direction. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My grandmother told me that she'd seen the man before, and he was known for acting strange and following people. She warned me to be careful and stay away from him. Every time I left the apartment, I felt like I was being watched, and I was sure that the man was following me. One day, I was walking to a local park when I heard someone calling my name. I turned around, and I saw that man standing a few feet away from me, with a creepy smile on his face.
"Come with me,"
he said, holding out his hand.
"I have something to show you."
I was really scared and unable to move or speak. The man stepped closer, and I could smell the stale scent of alcohol on his breath.
"Don't worry,"
he said, his voice low and menacing.
"I won't hurt you."
I screamed and ran back to my grandmother's apartment. I told her what had happened, and she called the police. They took my statement and said they would look into it, but I never heard back from them. That man had ruined my visit to my grandmother's town, and the whole time I was there, I felt like he was after me. I left town as soon as I could, and never looked back. I never wanted to see that man again. Later that year, I was talking to my grandmother on the phone, and she told me that the man was arrested. I never asked her what he did. To be honest, I was too scared to ask, and my grandmother never told me. I'm sure you can use your imagination, though. Since his arrest, I never saw that creepy guy again, and my grandmother never talked about him again either. I wouldn't have it any other way. I had just finished college when this happened. My girlfriend and I moved to an apartment in a new city. It was a small, cozy place, with just enough space for the 2 of us. We were excited to start our new life together and make some new memories. I had taken a job at an insurance company. It was not my ideal work, but my student loans were larger than I cared to admit, so I took the highest paying job I could find. My girlfriend hadn't found work yet, but she was looking. The building where we lived was an older one, but it had been well maintained, and the neighbors were friendly. It was only 5 stories, but it took up a whole city block. It was like a big U shape with a parking lot in the middle. We were on the first floor, and our view was nothing to brag about. There were other people's windows facing ours in pretty much all directions. It was like we were on display to the rest of the building. We quickly settled in and started to feel at home. But after a few weeks, I started to feel like something was off. One day when I was cooking dinner, I noticed that the blinds in the apartment across from ours were open by just a crack. I could see a small silver light coming through, almost like a camera lens or binoculars. At first, I brushed it off thinking that it was just a coincidence, but it happened again the next night, and the night after that. I felt like I was being too paranoid at first. It was very subtle. I really felt like somebody was spying on us. I would catch glimpses of movement from behind the blinds, and as time went on, I became convinced that there was somebody watching us through that window. I talked to my girlfriend about it, and she agreed that it was strange and that we should do something. We decided to talk to the landlord about what was going on. We described our concerns and asked if he knew who was living in that apartment across from us. The landlord refused to get involved because we didn't really have any solid evidence. It was really just our feelings at the moment. One night, my girlfriend and I were staying up late watching TV. At around midnight, the blinds in that apartment across from us suddenly opened, and we could see a shadowy figure inside. It was the first time that we'd seen who was in that apartment. We stood there at the window peeking through the blinds, and eventually, the light in the other apartment turned on. We recognized the guy. I had seen him around the building, but we never really talked. He was about 30 years old with dark black hair and thick glasses. He had the kind of face where it looked like he was not even capable of smiling. I'm not sure how else to describe it, just a constant frown. He was looking right at us. No doubt he knew we were there. The next night, my girlfriend and I were sleeping in our bedroom. Our bed was right next to the window, and we always kept the curtains shut. I woke up to the sound of tapping on the glass. I sat up in bed, my girlfriend still asleep. I slowly peeked through the curtains, and sure enough, that neighbor of ours was standing there. Dim light from the building fell upon half his face, creating a truly frightening appearance. I closed the curtains as fast as I could and grabbed my phone. I called the police and explained what happened. They sent an officer over, but our neighbor was gone by then. We filed a report and told the landlord the next day. Terrifying as the night was, in a way it was really a relief. Until then, we felt like we were going crazy. Whenever we tried to explain what was happening, it seemed like it could be all in our head. With what happened that night, there was no doubt that that guy was a weirdo. We packed up our belongings and moved to a different part of town soon after. I still have no idea what happened to that neighbor of ours. I think he should be charged with stalking or something, but we didn't follow through with it. Our new apartment was a fresh start for us. We were grateful to be able to put that experience behind us. We made sure to pay a little extra to get a place on a higher floor. We were happy to be in our new place. It was a little more expensive, but it felt more secure, and we haven't had any problems since.